Now I will give the floor to Professor Ruxandra Ivan from the University of Bucharest. Her topic is the elections for the European Parliament and the construction of European identity.
Thank you, Professor Daniel Barbu. I'm aware that talking about European nation building is somehow behind the historical experience that we have, and that it might seem a little bit far-fetched to speak of a European nation building. However, I think that we can try to see the way in which the institutional arrangements of the European Union have contributed to the democratization of the European polity. And precisely my contribution is trying to investigate the way in which the universal suffrage for the European Parliament contributed to or not to the consolidation of a European identity. There is a consensus among theorists that the electoral system is one of the most effective instruments for political engineering. For example, Giovanni Sartori said in 1968 in an article that is called Political Development and Political Engineering that electoral systems are the most specific manipulable instrument of politics, while Arendt Liebhardt in 1995 stated that if one wants to change the nature of a particular democracy, the electoral system is likely to be the most suitable and effective instrument for doing so. So there is a vast body of literature investigating the links between the configuration of the electoral system and the evolution of the political communities. One of the most famous researches in the field is the book of Pippa Norris from 2004, Electoral Engineering, Voting Rules, and Political Behavior. And in this book, she investigates two different schools of thought about the effectiveness of electoral engineering. On the one hand, rational choice institutionalism, which claims that by changing the incentives offered by electoral rules, those who design the electoral systems have the capacity to alter the behavior of parties, politicians, and citizens, and therefore they have the capacity to help solve different social problems such as ethnic conflicts or improving turnout or strengthening the links between the voters and the parties. On the other hand, the alternative theories say that there is not such a large capacity of electoral engineering to achieve these goals. These are the theories of cultural modernization, who insist rather that the formal rules adapt rather than alter the deeply embedded patterns of human behavior. However, the conclusion of Pippa Norris is that the first series of theories is better suited to explain what happened in reality, that is, rational choice institutionalism. And she actually shows how the several aspects of electoral systems can modify the structure and the political stakes in a society. And these aspects of electoral systems are the ballot structure, that is the way in which voters can express their choices, the electoral threshold, the electoral formula which determines how votes are counted to allocate seats, and the district magnitude. Finally, in what concerns the capacity of the electoral system to contribute to nation building, I will invoke the book of Daniele Caramani on the nationalization of politics, the formation of national electorates and party systems in Western Europe, who shows how throughout the 19th century electoral system have helped to homogenize territorially the nation states and have contributed to the emergence of political issues on national level and not only on regional and community levels. Now, based on this body of literature, the main question that I asked myself when thinking about the issue about the topic of this conference was whether it is possible to build a European identity through electoral engineering, and whether this has been done by the institutional fathers of the European construction. But, well, this question is somehow linked to one idea which is also very present in the literature and which says that democracy is impossible without a demos, and that democracy is very difficult to conceive outside the framework of the nation state. Or, obviously, the European polity has had this problem from the beginning, and it continues to have it nowadays, the lack of a proper European demos, let's say, which could be able to form the basis of the political body and of a political community. Now, of course, that in the history of the European construction, the moment when the member states decided that it was the time to pass to electing the European Parliament through universal suffrage was linked to a crisis of legitimacy of the European Union, I would say, because in the first year of its existence, the European Union had a teleological legitimacy which was based on the purpose for which it was created, that is to prevent the emergence of another European war. This level of legitimacy was doubled by an output legitimacy or a performance legitimacy, which consisted in the effectiveness of European policies for reconstructing the economies of member states after the Second World War. But already in the middle of the 70s, these two major pillars of the legitimacy of European institutions have begun to diminish, and the stake was at that time to replace or to transfer the model of the legitimacy of the European institution to a democratic model. And this is why the first elections for the European Parliament through universal suffrage have taken place in 1979. Well, this profoundly changed the institutional dynamics of the European Union because, of course, it strongly consolidated, it laid the basis for gradual consolidation in time of the powers of the European Parliament, which not only has budgetary powers, but in time with the treaties of Maastricht and especially, of course, Lisbon, the European Parliament fully became associated to the decision-making process through the procedure of co-decision. And nowadays, most of the matters decided at European level make the object of these kind of procedures. This gave a lot of weight to the European Parliament in the institutional architecture of the European Union, but, well, I'm not sure of the fact that this also consolidated the democratic legitimacy of the European Union, because as you might know from the vast literature on this subject, there is a problem of perceived democratic deficit, which is also the subject of one of the interventions today, so I will not insist thereupon. However, I would like to briefly mention some of the technical aspects of the European elections in order to see whether or not these can contribute to the consolidation of identity. The legal basis for organizing elections for European Parliament through universal suffrage are Article 14 of the Treaty of the European Union and Articles 20, 22, and 223 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and also the Act of 1976 concerning the election of the representatives of the Assembly by direct universal suffrage. This act actually lays the common principles that member states share in organizing European election. Now, the problem that has been emphasized by all the literature on European elections is the fact that the electoral systems in different countries are very different, and that there is no uniform procedures for organizing these elections. There are only very few common principles. One of them is the principle of proportional representation, which can be used either in the form of a party list or in the form of the single transferable vote system. And the second principle is that the territory can be divided in constituencies, but in order not to affect the proportional nature of the voting system. And this is why some states have single constituencies, while there are 5 states who have several constituencies. The electoral threshold varies from 1.8% in Cyprus to 5%, which is the maximum for several member states. The date of the election varies. They are established in a time frame, in a week in May usually, but according to the national traditions, voting can take place from Thursday to Sunday. There are different rules for validating the results in the member states. There are different rules for electoral campaigns depending on national legislation in the field. And finally, all these makes the landscape of European election very, very diverse. And there were several attempts to try to make this more uniform, because it has been said that common rules would enhance the identification of the citizens with the European polity. The two most probable modifications that European decision makers are talking about today are transnational lists and the so-called Spitzenkandidaten. Transnational lists is an initiative of the European, it was proposed by Jean-Claude Juncker in his speech of the Union in September 2017. The idea is that 10% of the seats of the European Parliament should form a European constituency for which transnational lists should be drawn. Now, transnational lists, according to what has been researched on electoral engineering in different countries, they could lead to a better structuring of the political landscape of the European Union. For example, it has been proven that electoral engineering can be used to solve ethnic conflicts. Of course, you don't have that kind of conflicts in the European Union, but transnational lists could facilitate acquaintance of the national electorates with foreign politicians, but not only. They could lead to, in time, to the adoption of more centrist political positions of the political parties, because the candidates will seek for electoral support outside their national groups, and therefore they will not be able to use a nationalist rhetoric as an electoral weapon. And this is why I believe that transnational lists might be a solution to stop the emergence of the so-called illiberal democracies all through Europe. However, the practice of Spitzenkandidaten, of the parties, the European parties already stating the name of the proposed president of the European Commission before the elections, they were thought to create a more direct link between the voters and the Commission, which is perceived as an executive, although it's not really the case. But, well, since the powers of the Commission are, and the powers of the institution of the European Union are so intertwined, the stake of the European elections will not be perceived as important. And this is actually one of the explanations for the very low turnout for European elections, that the citizens do not perceive these elections as making an important difference. And this is very linked to the very complicated institutional architecture of the European Union, in which you don't have a very precise system of separation of powers. And finally, however small these changes might seem, there is a great reluctance of member states to adopt them. The principle of the leading candidate has been practiced in the 2014 elections, and it will probably be practiced for 2019. But about transnational lists, there are still very strong oppositions from the member states. So, in conclusion, I would say that if electoral engineering might be an effective tool for enhancing European identity, I think that this process is very slow, and this European identity is actually very slow to emerge. And I think that the question asked in his opening statement by Professor Barbu, what kind of nations are produced by suffrage, should also be a question that should preoccupy us in the case of the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor.